Hello, everyone. Hope you all are doing good and keeping safe. My name is Saurabh, and I'll be your host for today. I would like to thank you all for joining us for this week's Saturday webinar on importance of self-leadership. A bit about the topic. See, we all want to be good leaders someday, and we learn or read or watch things about leadership development, but you know, but nothing really helps out. And most of the things that we read generally about leadership development is, you know, talks about the process of building leaders of the other people and include topics like communication, conflict management, delegation, just to name a few. But the bigger challenge that a leader needs to solve or conquer is basically to lead yourself. Uh, and that's exactly what we'll be learning from today's session. Uh, we largely try to help you find answers to three thoughts, which is what does it mean to lead self? What does it take to become a self leader? And how can you and your partners benefit from the self leadership? So, and our speaker for today is Komal Singh. Komal has more than a decade of experience in the HR domain and worked with companies like Nokia, Diageo, Intuit, and primarily between as business partner and or employee relationship roles. Currently, she is senior HR business partner, India and APAC for InMobi, and we would like to thank Komal for her time as well for today's webinar. So before we get on to the other stuff, I just have a quick facts about the speaker. So the first speaker fact of the day is Komal has traveled to more than 60 countries, but and she apparently also likes to spend most of her time in listening to music and also planning for the next trip. Komal, I'm so jealous right now, but I'm really sure the lockdown must have changed your plans and some of your hobbies as well. We'll try to find more about that from Komal later. Another fact about Komal is she is one of the speakers in our upcoming HR Tech Summit, which is happening on 25th and 26th of July, which is next to next Friday and Saturday. And for all the people attending today, we'll post the link. And there's also a 50% discount code that we're offering. Although the tickets are not really expensive, it's just $7, but we are still giving a discount of 50% just because we are nearing to it. And we'll post all that content on the under the chat section in some time. Also, today we have people from across the India. And before I pass it on to Komal, I just wanted to give you a quick heads up on a few things to make sure that we keep the webinar engaging and interactive. So we'll be shooting polls in between just to make sure that you are attentive and you're liking the stuff that you're doing. The poll will look something like this. It will be on the screen for between 20 to 30 seconds, and it's just a frenzy fun poll. So you can just kill that poll button and submit button, and we'll get the answers from you. Okay, so this is how the poll will work. So let's see how it's happening. Okay, so most of you had a mediocre, okay experience. No one had a bad experience at the lockdown, which is great. Now, something insightful. What do you think about this one? Okay. So most of us think that we need another lockdown uh, for this. Cool. So that's great. We'll be shooting such questions in between as well. Uh, a few other rules. If you have any question that you want to ask to Komal, you can do it so under the chat section. You can post your questions there, and Komal will answer it, or we'll take the question and convey it to Komal. Uh, at any given point, if you want to talk to Komal directly, or if you have the question uh, to her, we can. If you have any question, you can just click on the raise hand button on your right. There are three options that you see. So if you click on raise hand button, we'll unmute you and you can post your question directly. Also, we'll be doing a Q&A session towards the end of the session. So keep all your major questions handy, and then we'll take it together later. Now I'll pass it on to Komal, who'll take it from here. Komal, over to you, please.
Thanks, Saurabh. Quick check if I am audible.
Yes, you are loud and clear. Sounds good.
And visible as well. I have turned on my video. Is everyone able to view me?
Yeah. Yes, we can see you.
Yeah. Great. So, hi everyone. Thanks a lot for joining in during this time. I'm sure it's a learning Saturday that we're all looking for. Hopefully the next 1 hour or so is gonna help all of us kind of discover a little bit of self-leadership within ourselves. And if you do have questions, please feel free to put them up in the chat window. We're going to kick off the session today with a very, very important question, which is, what is self-leadership to you? And I want to request everyone to, put in their responses. I can see those in the chat window, and I will read them out as and when those responses are coming in. So please do share what is self-leadership to you. One word responses, absolutely okay.
We got answers like self-discipline, decision-making power, Chavi saying to control ourselves. So here's some introspective answers in terms of what self-leadership means.
Great. And I think what I noticed in some of those responses is that they're all inward looking, and that's absolutely what self leadership is primarily about. It is inward looking. A lot of leadership skills that you would learn in your workplace or even in your personal growth and personal effectiveness are about how do you create an impact. Self leadership is primarily about how do you create an impact through inward measures. So I'm glad that some of us are thinking on those lines already. And those responses are very much a part of self leadership. Is my screen changing?
Yes.
Okay, great. Was just checking if the tech part is working perfectly. So self-leadership is first and foremost about knowing who you are. And that is a very critical element when we talk about a leadership skill that's inward looking, because that's really the starting point of knowing who I am. Uh, the second critical element is who do you want to be? And we'll talk a lot more about each of these areas as we move forward. And third, why do you want to be there? Knowing who you are, who do you want to be, and knowing why do you want to be there. When we talk about knowing who you are, there are two elements that are very critical within this. How do you define yourself? What are some of the, what are some of the words that you would use if someone was to ask you, how do you see yourself? What is your idea of who you are as a person? Is it lively? Is it quiet? Is it, could be something as as strong as I'm not sure, and that's absolutely okay. A lot of people sometimes don't want to define themselves in certain ways, and that's okay to call that out as well. It's also important to see how do others how do you think others define you. And this is something that all of us have an idea of how others would define us. Now, that could be something that's based on something or that's not based on something, but it's also important to have an idea of not just how you see yourself, but also how are others seeing you. And the truth is, we all exist somewhere in between those two realities. Let me take an example. Um, and I'll take my own example because I think that's easier as a starting point. But would love for people to also share their own examples in the chat window. So please do feel free to add how you see yourself versus how do others see you. But just to take a very simple example, one thing that this lockdown situation has taught me is that a lot of people have viewed me as somebody who's an extrovert. Because I do go out there, I interact with a lot of people. I share my opinions, on various topics as and when there are those opportunities. So a lot of people have been viewing me as the person who's extrovert, who's out there, who's making a presence felt. In reality, though, I'm very much an introvert. It's primarily because of my role and the work that I do in the people domain that I'm used to having a workplace, almost, a workplace persona for myself where I am outgoing, I am putting myself out there, making myself available and approachable to people. But in reality, I'm very much an introvert. I enjoy keeping to myself, and I enjoy having that space to myself as well. And that's where we actually exist in between those two realities. um, there are moments when I'll be an introvert, there are moments when I'll be an extrovert, and this holds true for all of us. None of us are black or white, we're all existing in different shades of gray. And so it's also important to sometimes recognize that it's between those two that we're possibly lying somewhere. What that does is also it helps you recognize your blind spots. And we all have to accept that we all have blind spots. None of us come with a perfect self-awareness of who we are and how we're perceived by people. And so it's also important to continually ask these questions to yourself to understand how do I define myself and how are others defining me, so that I can understand where between those two realities do I really exist, and why is that an important point is something that we'll talk about when we talk about the next stage of who do you want to be. And the reason some of these blind spots can also become very critical in our self leadership is because it helps us balance the self and social awareness aspect. And this becomes very important when we go to the point of who do I want to be, because it's one thing to know how am I perceived, how do I perceive myself, but it's also important to know how do I want people to perceive me. And that's where the balancing of self and social awareness really comes in place. Just a quick quote, that I thought of when I was putting this together is, it's important to be yourself because everybody else is already taken, and so it's absolutely okay to completely be yourself. Who do you want to be? We spoke a little while back about balancing self and social awareness. Why is that impactful to be a strong self leader? Who do you want to be is a combination of various factors. One of those factors is what risks do you enjoy taking, and this is where it's a part of your self leadership to understand how do I want to put myself out there, how much do I want to put myself out there, having known where my perception lies, where my true self lies. What are the areas in which I want to be approached for? Do I want to be approached for for critical strategic measures? Do I want to be approached do I want to be approached for and known for being somebody who comes from a thought process, who comes from an execution excellence space? And so it's important to understand which are the risks in which I want to expand myself, in which I want to be known for, and to be curious about those proactively, because that's what's gonna help culminate and cement for others to look at you that way. And so it's important to understand what are the risks that I enjoy taking, and identify that self drive. Um, am I somebody who's more, who wants to be more inclined on having a more philosophical thought process, or am I somebody who wants to be more inclined towards having a more realistic approach, a more pragmatic approach, or am I somebody who wants to be looked at, and the risks that I want to take is about how do I balance the EQ and the IQ, or is it completely about emotional quotient? And each of those options are absolutely okay. Self leadership is about defining that for yourself. And that's essentially what I mean when I say, who do you want to be? Embrace the balance between influence and action. When we start to look inwards and when we start to think through who do I want to be, and that's about who do I want to be known as, that's where we will all be operating somewhere between influence and action. Very rarely would we be in a position in the workplace, so to say, where we're in a place where we can influence everything or that we can action on anything. That rarely happens. I think that's a reality that we all deal with. Having said that, you can embrace and create the right balance basis your own self drive. What I mentioned, a couple of different areas that I mentioned just a few minutes ago about different ways in which your self drive can culminate in the workplace. And that's where you want to know which are those areas where I can influence and which are those areas where I can directly action. And that is different for each person depending on the role you play, depending on the equity you enjoy in the organization, depending on the equity that you want to enjoy in the organization. And a lot of self leadership is primarily about cultivating that aspect of yourself that you want people to understand about you. Why is it important to embrace the balance between influence and action? Because we know what we know and we don't know what we don't know. And that's where it's important to have a balance between influence and action, because otherwise it can lead to a sense of frustration, or it can lead to a sense of dejectedness about not being able to influence enough or not being able to action enough. And so it's always going to be a balance of the two. It's always going to be a combination of influencing and action that you will find yourself cultivating around you. Once we understand who we are and we take the time to understand who we are, once we take the time to understand how others perceive us, and then take that to the next stage of looking at how do I want to be perceived, who do you want to be, it's important then to look at defining your ecosystem and the needed catalysts that are required for a change to happen. The reason I talk about ecosystem here is because no man is an island. This is a very old saying that no man is an island, and this is absolutely true in workplaces more than any other environment. I think in other environments, in your personal life, in your personal relationships, there's a lot more capacity to operate individually. However, when it comes to the workplace, it is very much an outcome of your ecosystem. The DNA of the organization that you work in will largely define how your brand gets cultivated in the organization, depending on who do you want to be. What I mean by that, let me take an example here. If there is an organization that's extremely process oriented, for example, and if you're somebody who comes absolutely from an emotional quotient place, then that's something that will get viewed as standing out for people around you, for people in your ecosystem. And is that to say that you should change any of those aspects? Not necessarily. Self leadership is about making a choice. And that's the reason, this slide reads, who do you want to be? And not just how are people looking at you? Because self leadership is about defining what am I going to represent. And that's the culmination of both your self and social awareness, and bringing that to where do I want to cultivate myself. And so it's very critical to define your ecosystem. Is my what are the drives of of my ecosystem? How do those correlate to who I am as an individual and who I want to be known by the organization and by the people around me? And basis that, you can look at what are some of the catalysts that you require. For me, this George Bernard Shaw quote is possibly one of the most impactful quotes that I've come across in my life, especially from a career perspective. That life isn't about finding yourself; life is about creating yourself. And that's what I talk about, between the last slide and this slide, to say that when you look at who you are, and finding yourself in some ways between the self and the social, that's when it's important for you to also create yourself and see, and create the kind of brand that you want to create. Quick question to everyone. We've spoken a little bit about understanding who you are. We've spoken a little bit about understanding how you want to be viewed. What are some of the tools that you think you can leverage in identifying your leadership fingerprint, in identifying what's the brand that you create as a leader? Please do share your answers in the chat window, and Saurabh can maybe read those out. I'm not able to see those in the chat window.
Yes, so Komal, we have got answers like Abhijit says, could it be MBTI? And we have Jocelyn who is saying that it can be feedback or survey. Then someone is saying it's like empowering people and uh, train your team and peers continuously. And Poonam says it's a teamwork. So we have got multiple answers, like someone says retrospect, a psychometric profiling, expressing myself, then informal feedback from the team. So these are the answers that we have received for this.
Great. Thanks a lot. I think that was Sneha. Thanks a lot, Sneha. And yes, those are some of the different ways in which we can identify what's the leadership fingerprint that we're creating in the organization. Another one I can add to that mix is the SWOT analysis, and very often we take on, the strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. We take on those analysis for identifying various opportunity areas, in the work that we're doing or in certain processes or whatever have you. But we can very much leverage SWOT analysis also for seeing what's the kind of leadership brand that I'm creating. And how am I viewed in terms of my strengths, in terms of my opportunities, threat areas, so on and so forth. And I think a couple of people mentioned different psychometrics like MBTI, and there are other psychometrics that are out there as well. And absolutely, you can use some of those psychometric assessments to also identify how your leadership fingerprint is coming about. What's also impactful about some of these tools is that they also very often they also come with a strong support on how can you leverage them to go from where you are to where you want to be. Where is your leadership fingerprint today versus where do you want your leadership fingerprint to be? So do continue to leverage some of those tools. I'm glad that some of us are already thinking of using these in different ways, and that's a great starting point for all of us. Okay. Uh, we spoke about knowing who you are, and we spoke about knowing who you want to be. Why do we want to find those answers? Um, the reason it's helpful and the reason it's important as self leaders to find those answers and understand those in a little bit more depth is because that should tie into, especially when we talk about self leadership, that should tie into what is your idea of success. And everyone can have a different idea. Our idea of success very often becomes our purpose. And this idea of success could be in your workplace, it could also not be in your workplace. Either of those options are absolutely okay. Your idea of success may be very, very different from the person who's next to you, and that's absolutely okay as well. Um, it's important to communicate your idea of success because that cements your brand of leadership. If your idea of success is that I'm the go-to person in the organization for strategic projects, if your idea of success is that I'm at a certain designation, for example, and it's important that whatever your idea of success is, that you put it out there. You put it out there in your ecosystem, not just not just to your immediate leader or to your close circle, but put it out in the ecosystem so that people start recognizing you for where you want to be successful. A very simple example that I can take, and maybe this is drawing on someone else's experience, is I had somebody at a workplace, and this was a couple of years ago. I had someone at the workplace who would very often talk about, and this was somebody at a fairly senior leadership position. They often spoke about being a very effective leader, and moving more on the IQ than on the EQ. And I would very often have those coaching conversations with this leader to say, is this where you want to operate? Is this where you want to build your brand of leadership? And what I would often hear from that person is, well, this is who I want to be. This is my idea of success. My idea of success is not being known as an empathetic leader. While that's important as a part of my role in a leadership space, I want to be primarily known for the huge value that I create for the organization. How am I? How am I somebody who? How am I somebody who is the go-to person for creating an impact, not just in my space but in the organization overall? And so that individual was very much coming from a place of knowing, who they are, knowing how they are known in the organization, and also knowing who do they want to be. and they were very clear that their purpose was aligned with that. And so it's extremely important to define your idea of success. I've always strongly believed that time is the greatest gift that you can give to yourself, because time is the only way that you can step back and you can be the director to your own movie. You can decide, how do I want this movie to play out? And reflecting is the most powerful tool that you would find in being able to take that step back. A lot of times we are moving from one space to another without taking the time to just pause and to reflect and see, is this where I want things to be at? Self leadership is extremely high on reflection. It's extremely high on taking that step back and letting things mull for a time. A lot of times we want to fill the silence. We want to know what people are saying. We want to understand, how is this working, how is how am I being perceived. Sometimes it's about pausing and just listening is a very, very critical skill, and I'm sure we all hear that so often when it comes to leadership. The reason listening is important is because it helps you reflect, and that is extremely critical to being a successful self leader as well. Quick poll again to kind of understand where people are sitting at when it comes to understanding self leadership, and what's the kind of impact that it can make. So the question really is that, what can help you align your intent with your purpose to be more effective in the workplace? Is it reflection? Is it feedback? Is it communication? If you have a different answer, you can also put that in the chat. Sneha, Saurabh, I think you'll have to read out the responses, or how the poll
Yes.
response is coming up.
Yes, Komal. So we have 11% saying it's reflection, 7% saying feedback, 15% saying communication, and 67% says it's all of the above.
Yes, and I know, I didn't put all of the above in this poll question on this slide, and that was particularly intentional to kind of see if there are people who are also going to go for an option that doesn't exist. And sometimes we don't see what's not in front of us, but that's absolutely the right response. So, for the 60% people who did vote for that response, that's the ideal response. Yes, that very often being effective, which is drawing that commonality between what's your intent and how do I marry that to my purpose, is an outcome of all of these three. It's about reflecting basis feedback, and it's about communicating what you're learning and how you want to draw yourself in the workplace. Having spoken a little bit about what self leadership is, because very often we hear this word self leadership, we hear this word leadership, but are we giving shape and form to that word? So maybe, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow my own advice, and I'm going to take a step back quickly. I'm going to go back to the first slide that I had put up. That self leadership is about knowing who you are. It's about marrying that to who do you want to be, and understanding why do you want to be there. And all of these three are extremely important, so that as self leaders, we're able to create an inward based projection outwards. And that's where we started off this session, talking about the inwards versus the outwards, and how self leadership is so much about the inward. That inward is relevant, and that inward becomes effective when we're able to cultivate it outwards. And that's where why do you want to be there becomes a very critical element right at the end. So was just taking a step back to reflect on that aspect. Why is self-leadership really important? What's the benefit? What's in it for me? What's in it for other people? And that's a very important question to be asking for self-leadership, because there is a fair amount of investment that goes into having self-leadership, that goes into taking time to reflect. It takes time away from other things, of course. And so why is it impactful? What's the benefit? The benefit of self leadership that I found very often is that it enhances your personal effectiveness because you're creating a conscious brand for yourself, as opposed to having the ecosystem drive the narrative. You're driving the narrative. And self leadership is the strongest tool that you can use to drive that narrative. It gives the ability to others to be their whole selves with you, because they're seeing you cultivate a conscious brand for yourself by communicating that externally, so they feel comfortable. So the person who's opposite to you, when they see you coming to the table and saying that, hey, this is who I am, this is where I want to be, known by you, this is where I want to be viewed by you, it gives others an opportunity to also be their whole selves and saying, oh, that's great, this is where I want to be, this is how I want to be viewed as well. And between those two is where you find your rhythm with various partners. Resilience is a very contagious thing, and the reason I say that is because a lot of times it takes time to cultivate a brand for yourself. It takes time for people to see you the way you see yourself, and it can be a little frustrating from time to time if that doesn't happen. If you're making some of those attempts and if that's not happening, it can be frustrating, it can be demotivating even sometimes. But that's why it's important to remember always that resilience is contagious, and sometimes it's important to keep at it, so to say. Don't go with your book unpublished. I like to use this. I like to use this phrase especially because very often we don't take the time to define our self leadership. We don't take the time to reflect. And I found this extremely common with leaders. They sometimes you want to be, you want to be very successful, or you want to be very aspirational towards the work that you're doing, that you don't take the time to pause, that you don't take the time to reflect and see, where is this really going, how is this really helping me and my partners. And so sometimes you may spend very many years in an organization, you may spend many years with people without them really knowing what is the book of this individual, who is this person really. And so don't go with your book unpublished, and take the time to reflect, take the time to communicate your reflections as well. Your influence is often enhanced when people identify with who you are, and with who, with the leader that you are as well. And that's where, when we spoke about influence and action, very often are we one or the other. But the influence aspect especially is something that I have personally found to be enhanced in a big way. Let me take an example for this actually, because I think influence is something that's a little bit more fluid than action. Action is something that's very much in our control. Influence is very often an outcome of your ecosystem as well. So let me take an example. A couple of years back, I was leading employee relations in an employee relations space in an organization, and I was leading it cross geographically. So I was working with another geography, which is very, very outcome oriented, which is extremely conscious about, why am I doing this? Where is this going to help me? If it's not going to help me, why spend time on this at all? And I realized that it needed me to take a step back and to see that, why would I do things differently here? When I'm working across two geographies, so let's say, it's one is India, because that's a more easier example that I think all of us can relate to. India has its own cultural nuances that impact the workplace and the kind of workplace that you would work in. When you work across geographies, and I've been fortunate to work across several different geographies in the last decade or so, when I started working with other geographies, I understood that their levers for motivation were sometimes very, very different from India. They were maybe not guided by a community feeling at all in some cases. It was very much about how is it this going to help me? How is this going to make my life better? Why should I spend my time on this at all? Which are not sometimes questions that I was coming across when I was working with my India counterparts, with some of the leaders in India. And so I realized that my influence in this new geography will only get enhanced if my brand of leadership is slightly different than what it is in another place. And that needed understanding, knowing who I am, knowing how is this place viewing me, and then cultivating basis all of this and basis what's the requirement of this ecosystem. How can I cultivate a brand of leadership that people identify with more? And that meant, being identified more as somebody who's action oriented, somebody who comes with a very clear purpose of those actions, and not necessarily, coming, indexing more heavily on the IQ than on the EQ. And very often the IQ and EQ are balance that you create as a leader, and that balance can be different in different parts of leadership. Sometimes as a new leader, as a young leader, you will index more on the IQ. As you grow in your leadership journey, maybe you index more on the EQ. This will also depend on the context of the organization that you're a part of, and it will be very much influenced as a decision by those factors as well. And so your influence in different parts and with different people is enhanced when people identify that, okay, this is your brand of leadership and this is how it coincides with my brand of leadership. And so that becomes an extremely important factor for helping your partners benefit from your self leadership as well. I think having spoken about different aspects of self-leadership, different benefits of self-leadership, what are some of the steps that we can take to be a self-leader? And some of this may be a little bit, culminating from the different things that we've spoken about till now as well. Identify your strengths and your limitations. I think we all have certain limitations, and of course we have different strengths that we bring in the workplace. It's important to identify what those are, and that identification can happen in various tools. Some of us mentioned psychometric tools, some mention things like feedback, and all of those are very critical to identifying what your strengths and limitations are. Discover your vision for yourself. This is where you'll very often hear the word purpose, and that's where purpose is extremely critical, because it helps you understand, this is the vision I want to create of myself as a self leader. Repeat success patterns. I cannot iterate this aspect enough, because very often we try something, it either works, it doesn't work, we don't, I've seen leaders very often not have patience. Patience is a very, very, very impactful element of being a strong leader. Very often it's about timing. It's not, your ecosystem is not an outcome of only you. It's an outcome of so many things coming together, and you're a part of the puzzle, but you're not the entire puzzle in any case, no matter what level of leadership you're at, no matter the kind of impact or the kind of role that you're playing, you will be a part of the puzzle. And so it's important to identify what are those success patterns that are helping me be a stronger part of that puzzle, and to continually repeat those success patterns so that people start identifying you stronger and in a stronger and stronger way with with how you want to be identified. And so repeating success patterns, having understood what your strengths and limitations are, and what's your vision of yourself, that success patterns, identifying and repeating those becomes a very critical element of what makes you successful as a self-leader. Trust yourself. I mentioned patience. I mentioned the word patience a while back, and sometimes when we don't see outcomes in the way that we want to see those outcomes, it makes you second guess yourself. It makes you doubt yourself. It makes you wonder, am I doing the right thing? Am I missing something? Why is it that things aren't happening in the way that I want them to happen in? So it's important to trust yourself in the decisions that you've taken, and because a lot of what we've spoken about today, if and I'm sure when you when you go forward from this session, and when you sit in the evening, maybe with a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, or maybe with a beer in your hand, a beverage in your hand, when you start to reflect on what did I learn in this session, how was it different from what I've been thinking about as a in the form of self leadership, there will be certain areas that you'll agree with, there will be certain areas that you'll not agree with, and it's important to trust yourself in your own deductions. And this is extremely critical when you start talking about the brand of leadership that you want to create, because only when you trust yourself will you be able to create confidence for other people to trust you. And so that's something that I would emphasize on in a big way as well. Communicate openly. Very often we would sit with something, and we would be, we can be reluctant in saying things out loud. We can be reluctant in asking questions that either make you uncomfortable or make someone else uncomfortable. We may sit with assumptions and anxieties in a lot of times, and it's important to communicate those openly, because only when you're able to put yourself out there will give people the possibility to receive you as well. If you're not communicating openly, if you're not putting yourself out there, if you're not calling out, hey, this is what I'm thinking, this is where I'm finding certain alignment or misalignment, will it give other people an opportunity to receive that information and to be able to communicate back to you and help you get from where you are to where you want to be, which are some of the more critical elements of being a self leader that we spoke about in the beginning. And so communicating openly is an extremely important tool to becoming a self leader. Be comfortable with what you decide. I want to take an example in talking about why being comfortable in what you decide is extremely critical. Um, this was only a few only a few years back that I remember having a conversation with somebody who was very young, very new in their leadership journey. They had just become a manager. They were excited about being a new manager. They were excited about understanding how can I create a different impact than I have in the past. And so we were having a lot of different conversations about what it means to be a new leader, what it means to be a leader to others and not just be a self leader. And I realized that that the space that I was coming from was very much in terms of helping the individual, and not necessarily only listening, but in also, and this I guess is also, it was coming from a space of the role that I was playing. So here I was playing the role of an HR business partner a few years back, and I was trying to help a leader, help a new leader, kind of have different reflections, help that person understand where they're coming from, where do they want to be. And and I decided in that moment when I was having some of those conversations that, what, in this particular instance, maybe I just want to be an absorption tool. Maybe I just want to be that person that the individual can open up to, and not necessarily come from a space of helping the individual. And it was important to be comfortable with that, because because up until the point that I was trying to help the individual, I was constantly approaching it from a place of, okay, this is what you can do, okay, that is what you can do. But I realized when I was doing some of the reflection on how those conversations were going, that the person was coming from a place of passion. This was an individual who was new in their role, and who was coming in with a passion of, this is how I want to do it. And sometimes in me telling them that, okay, this is how you can do it, or that is how you can do it, I was projecting my idea of how you can become a better leader on the individual, where the individual was already coming from a place of, this is how I can be a leader. And somewhere I was not being as impactful a leader as I could have been in that moment by just absorbing. And so I switched sides from being a tool of helping to becoming a tool of just absorption and just being that space where the person can open up and share what they're sharing. What that allowed for is, a couple of months down the line, and not immediately, but a couple of months down the line, that person started asking for help. As opposed to me providing that support and me providing that help, that individual started asking for help because they started being comfortable in what they were deciding, and they saw me comfortable in the decision that I had made. And it's important when you're making a choice for yourself to take the time for that choice to get cultivated. Because very often when you make a certain decision, it will not land immediately. It will take time for your ecosystem to realize that, oh, this is what this person has done. It's also important when you're making a decision about the brand of self leadership that you want to cultivate around you, uh, for you to for you to let it settle down, so to say. And so it's important to be comfortable with whatever you decide and not let the ecosystem always influence that as well. Let the outcomes go, fall in love with the process. I think this is a particularly difficult one because very often it happens that we let the outcomes define the process. We start from the end point and we work backwards. Depending on the role that we play in an organization, this can become even more natural to a lot of us. But sometimes having that space and giving yourself the space to reflect, giving yourself the space to allow yourself to take a step back, allows you to appreciate the process and not just the outcome, the journey and not the destination. I think that's another way of saying that as well. The question that I have for everyone is, what's the most important aspect in your mind in creating your leadership brand? And this is an open question. There are no options here because I don't think there's any right answer or wrong answer in this to this question. So, to you, when we talk about the journey of self leadership, what do you feel is the most important aspect in creating that leadership brand? And this is a moment where I would invite everyone to to self reflect on the last 50 odd minutes that you've spent thinking and reflecting about self leadership as we were going through this journey. So to you, what's the most important aspect in creating your leadership brand?
All right, so we are getting answers. So Abhijit Das says it's empathy plus lead by example. Then Anand Sriram says it's knowing what you want and self-reflection. Then we have someone saying self-awareness. Then Sudarshan is saying it's faith in your ability to lead a team. Then Chavi says it's trust yourself. Josle says it's being a mentor and role model. Then we have answer like it's present yourself. And then we have someone saying it's leading by example, learning, adapting as we go. Yes, so these are the answers we have received, Komal.
Sure. Thanks to thanks for everyone who participated, who shared their own reflections. When it comes to the leadership brand. Before we move to feedback and questions, I think those are all great responses. Um, I wanted to bring this quote up, and I know it's not, it talks about happiness, and it doesn't talk about success. And that's because that's my idea of success. I've spent the last 50 odd minutes talking about self leadership, and it would be unfair if I don't open about my idea of self leadership as well. My idea of success has always been drawn from happiness. Are you happy with what you're doing? Are you happy with the environment you've created? Are you happy with with what you're known for, and how you're identified as an individual? And so it took some time, and I want to share a personal example here. It took some time for me personally as well to go from a space of success being defined by a certain designation, or success being defined by a certain mark in my career, or a certain milestone in my career, to just figuring out, am I happy with what I'm doing? And that sometimes, and I'm going to quickly go back to, what does it take to become a self leader? Um, Identifying that my vision for myself was being a happy leader meant that I identified what were those patterns that helped me be more happy as a leader, that made me satisfied and content in the kind of leadership that I was creating. And it also meant very often trusting myself that yes, as long as I feel happy and I feel energized by being there, that's enough. And that if that means that I'm not signing up for something that maybe the ecosystem drives, or maybe others drive as projections of, hey, this is who I want you to be. Um, it's it, it took some time to be comfortable with that decision. And the reason I brought up this example is because very often, when we do the reflection, and very often when we do the defining of who we are, we may feel pressure to change that over a period of time. We may feel pressure to submit to this or that. But to me, the most important part of self leadership is really aligning with your vision and your purpose of who you want to be, and cultivating that essentially. And so I go back to that quote from the Dalai Lama, that happiness is not something that's ready-made. Happiness comes from your own actions, and that's where I hope the last 50 minutes, a little over 50 minutes actually, I hope the last 55 minutes or so have helped us in identifying what are those actions that are going to create my happiness at the workplace, in being a strong self leader. With that, I just want to thank everyone for being on this journey of the last, 55, 57 odd minutes. I want to open it up to anyone having questions. I see a couple of questions coming in. Okay, I see Abhijit Das. Hi, Abhijit. Abhijit Das' question is, how do you reliably gather work culture nuances from location overseas to architect people management? What are those tools besides interviews, that may be? Interviews are one way of gathering information. I think sometimes some of the engagement tools that exist in the organization, it could be surveys, it could be skip level conversations, for example, that that your HR has, or that you have, your leaders might have, that you collect inputs that are going to be valuable to understand those work nuances. Another I'm just sorry, I'm just going to go back to the
Yes,
question.
Komal, we have another question by Sudarshan. So I've
Yeah, I
put
just
it
want to
back as well.
complete the response for the question to Abhijit as well.
Okay,
So skip
fine.
levels and sure. So the skip level conversations, engagement surveys, and other engagement tools are one way of understanding the work culture nuances. Another way is also to speak to people, maybe from other industries, maybe from other workplaces as well, because very often the work culture nuances of another location overseas, need not directly be an outcome of your organization only, because we're talking about a different geography altogether. And so one of the impactful tools that I employed and that I found to be successful when I started working cross geographically is to talk to other organizations in that geography to understand what makes the difference here. What are the motivation factors that work differently in this country than that country. Sometimes doing some research, watching even movies sometimes can help you understand what influences that culture more than another culture. And so some of those factors can be useful. For example, a lot of times if you see movies based in India, you'll find this very common joke about how in India most people are engineers or doctors. What that actually says about a country is that it's very high on aspiration. If you see, for example, French movies, they'll talk about how a lot of people are artists, they're sitting in cafes. And so clearly having that space of leisure is what that country enjoys. And that those are some ways in which you can actually understand a lot more about culture than necessarily only looking at things from your own organization point of view. So I hope that helps, Abhijit. And those are tools that you can then use for people management as well. Another question that I see came in from Sudarshan is, what is the difference between self-leadership and self-management? So I think and some of these terms I know are often used interchangeably. Self-management usually is about, the first two things, about mm, looking at the self and social awareness, which we spoke about right at the very start of the conversation today. Self-management is about knowing what's the self-awareness, or in terms of where I am, and where am I being seen by other people. And self-management very often stops there. Self-leadership is that next step forward when you start consciously cultivating something, when you consciously start creating a brand for yourself in the workplace. And that's a nuance difference between self-leadership and self-management, because very often these terms get thrown around, very interchangeably. But that's essentially how I view self-leadership, as one step beyond self-management, because you're taking the time to create something from what exists, from not just managing a certain situation, but leading a certain situation. And that's often, something that we also talk about, difference between management and leadership, where one is doing things in certain way and another is creating something altogether. Another question that's come in from Saloni is, we all know that controlling self is more difficult as compared to controlling others, absolutely. But reality is, we only can be successful if we work on self. Kindly give us some effective practical tips to improve self-leadership aspects in this current competitive and political environment, where many a times we keep on ignoring the self. Slightly long question, so I'm gonna take a couple of seconds and read it again. So the first part of of the question, and I think that's a slight reflection, and absolutely correct, Saloni. Controlling self is a little different from controlling others, and you can't control others very often. But you can influence others. And that's where, one of the aspects that I spoke about when I mentioned self-leadership is about communicating to people. It's about identifying how others are seeing and basis that communicating effectively with people. Making certain active decisions, certain intentional decisions that lead to you being a self-leader. And so the second part of the question, which is about, kindly give us some effective practical tips to improve self-leadership in the current competitive and political environment. I think we all as self-leaders, this was an important reflection I had a couple of years back. Somebody asked this question from a different leader. I was part of the session. and somebody asked the leader that, you sound slightly different from other leaders. You sound um, a little bit more like everyone. You were not coming from a space of a slight superiority, because in that organization, a lot of times when leaders spoke, they were viewed, within, with everyone looking upwards. But this was a leader who was viewed as one of us. And so, what that leader told left a strong mark on me as a new leader myself back then. Is she said that, I know what I'm willing to let go, and I know what I'm not willing to let go of myself. We all have certain aspects of our life that we amp up the volume or amp down the volume on when it comes to the workplace. And it's important to take a strong stand on, this is what I'm willing to amp up and this is what I'm willing to amp down. And that's essentially what self leadership is about making those intentional decisions. A couple of practical tips that I mentioned in the last slide, in terms of identifying what are your strengths and limitations, and basis that identification, taking that intentional stand of, this is what I will do and this is what I'll not do. um, that can really help in dealing with the political environment, especially because I think all of us very often talk about this aspect of the workplace and of the environment, that there are certain political elements to it, there are certain competitive elements to it. So it's important to draw your own lines, it's important to draw your own boundaries on, this is what I'll do, this is what I'll not do, this is what I'll let go of, from maybe my absolute natural self, to support the ecosystem more, and this is whatLl not let go of. And like you mentioned, many a times we keep on ignoring the self. I think if you continually reflect on yourself, Saloni, if you continually take the time to pause and to assess a situation and then make a conscious decision, and be comfortable with that decision. Trust yourself that this is the decision that's right for me, even if it doesn't necessarily lead to the outcome that I wanted. Because it will not be that in every situation the decision that I take is going to lead to directly the outcome that I want. So it's important to trust yourself on your decision. It's important to not marry your intentions with always the outcome. It's important to marry your intention with your purpose. Why am I doing that? And not necessarily start from a place of outcome, because extremely often we can't control the outcome that comes out. We can only control what we did for that outcome to come out, and then go from there. I hope that helps, Saloni. There's a question from Grishma, how often we should reevaluate our self-leadership? I don't think there's a right answer to this, Grishma. It completely depends on the outcomes that you're getting from any time that you pivot your self-leadership. If you're getting the outcomes that you think are important to you, that align to your purpose, then maybe you don't need a pivot as often. If you are finding that you're struggling in your self leadership, if you're finding that the more steps that you take, you're not getting the outcomes that you want, and those outcomes don't align with your purpose in the workplace, then maybe you need to pivot more often, or you need to take more time to kind of self reflect and evaluate why it's happening in a certain way and why it's not leading to the outcomes that you want. Outcomes in terms of the idea that you have of success, and not necessarily the general idea. So if that is happening and if you're finding it a struggle, you can evaluate things more often than not. But if you're getting the right outcomes and if you're getting the outcomes that you want, then maybe that pivot is not required as often. So it's very much, it depends. Question by Ritu, how do you stay motivated and keep the negative emotions away? I wish I had the answer to that, Ritu. I don't think as much as any of us try, we can completely keep negative emotions away. I think that's the nature of emotions. They come up as they will. What we can do is we can learn how to deal with those emotions. This was a phrase that I heard many years ago, in a personal life context, that every emotion and every feeling is beautiful as long as you know how to deal with it. Even, even dejection, even disappointment, as long as you know how to deal with that emotion, and as long as you know how to channel that emotion in the way that you want to channel it, that emotion is absolutely perfect to have. And so allow yourself to have the negative emotions, Ritu. Allow yourself to not be motivated sometimes, and that's what being comfortable with your decisions, being comfortable with what you've decided means. Sometimes, the outcome that I'm trying to drive in the workplace as an HR business partner, or as an employee relations partner, it's not the outcome that I wanted. And it's important to be comfortable with, okay, I tried, it didn't work, let's move from here. That sometimes becomes very important, to try and keep yourself motivated. So try and deal with emotions as opposed to keeping them away, I would say. Question from Samir: how could we project the practical understanding of self-leadership in job interviews? That's a great question, Samir. I think, with this, with the current situation of COVID, I know that a lot of people have been looking at, how do I be more successful in that recruitment area as well. So I would say that what's important is, before there are any of these job interviews happening, try and put down what is the persona that you want to create. What is it that, what are the three things, for example, that you want an interviewer to take back about you, once that interview is over, and try and cultivate your, your impact in that job interview around those 3 or 4 takeaways. For example, when I was putting together this entire presentation, this entire deck, I was very clear that there are 3 things that I want people to take away. I want people to take away what is self-leadership exactly, why is it important for me and for others that I have self-leadership, and the third thing was, how can I be a self-leader? And so start from having 2 or 3 outcomes and takeaways that you want somebody to have at the end of the interview, and try and build from there. And see if the answers that you're giving, and see if the, outcomes that those answers, and those responses are having, are aligning to, that idea of those 3 or 4 takeaways of your brand as a leader, that it's creating. And so in a job environment, those takeaways can become very important. Question by Sham: how to control, prioritize, and manage emotions? This is a slightly difficult one, Sham, because I think it's very dependent on the person that each person is. Each of us are different, or our DNAs are different, for a reason. They say that each human being on the face of earth, even within a family itself, we all have different fingerprints, and that's for a reason. The reason behind that is because all of us react in different ways. All of us intake things in different ways. The way I am affected by, someone saying something negative about me, can be very different from how someone else is affected. I think what's important, and what I found impactful in my personal and professional life, is to listen. A lot of times when we get feedback, we try and see, okay, how can I change this, or how can I change that, or why did this happen, or why did that not happen. One of the most impactful things that I've learned about feedback and about self leadership is that if someone felt it, I'm sure they're right for them. If someone felt a certain way, I'm sure they believe that. And that means believing something about yourself that is different from how you always thought yourself to be. And so when it comes to managing the emotions that other people, bring on to you, it's important to let those emotions go. It's important to take the time to let it settle down in you, and let it and let yourself feel the way you're feeling. If that means you're feeling dejected, if that means you're feeling elated, if that means you're feeling excited, any of those emotions are great to have. Because all emotions are great to have. Life would be very one note if we didn't have different emotions, coming on to us each and every day. And so I don't think you should control emotions first and foremost. I also don't necessarily think you should prioritize emotions. I think you should manage emotions. So for me, I think, take the time to see how you manage your emotions. A simple example of that is, I'm somebody who's very high on self starter as an emotion. So if I don't see, people recognize that about me, I can feel a little bit demotivated that, why are people not seeing that in me? And whenever I feel that demotivation, I just take some time and I switch off. I take the time to just let that emotion sit with me, let it mull over, and let the moment pass. And that's my way of managing that emotion. Somebody else's way of managing that emotion could be that they try and deduce certain reasons for it. And so each person's way of managing it can be very different. But I would absolutely say, don't try and control emotions, don't try and prioritize emotions, because I don't think any of us will be very successful with that. Or if you are, then let me know how. Because for me, I think I've always found managing emotions to be a lot more successful.
Well, we
A question.
always touched the end mark. So we'll take this last question from Deepika, and then we'll move toward the closing.
Sure. Last question that came in from Deepika is, how do you influence upwards, downwards, and laterally? Influence is an interesting area, because how one person is influenced is different from how another person is influenced. Some people are influenced more when they see something in you. Some people are more influenced when they see an outcome. Other people are more influenced by emotions. And so how each person is influenced can be very different, Deepika. I think what can be impactful is to figure out how the other individual is influenced, and then go from there. And that's where social awareness, which I spoke about at the start of the session, is very, very critical in a lot of things that follow. And so how you influence upwards, downwards, and laterally will be a direct outcome of how somebody is influenced who's upwards, downwards, or laterally. Each person's motivation factors are very, very different, and so identifying what those motivation factors are and using those in cultivating your brand is what I would recommend on that. It's not a specific response, because I think leadership is one area where a lot of it not just depends on what you're doing, but it also depends on the other individual. And so that's where it's always important to try and marry the two and be comfortable with the marriage that you're creating. So I hope that answers your question in some part, Deepika. If anyone does have any questions, I'm not sure, Saurabh, maybe they can write into you, and I can, I can always get connected and try and help the, individual, or try and create an understanding on that. I hope this was a session that was helpful for everyone. Please do, share your feedback. Would love to understand, how this has been impactful for you the last 1 hour, little more than 1 hour.
Right. We are still getting questions, but then we'll ask them to probably direct it to our email box, and then we can probably jam it to you or forward it to you, and then take it forward. Please. So I'll just drop a message on. Please mail us on contact@devin.com. Cool. So I mean, we should respect the time window or the frame that we have, and probably try to move towards the closure of things. So Kumal, to be really honest, it was a really great talk. I mean, very introspective, kind of self-scrutinizing or contemplating in a way. I mean, I'll also start reflecting on a few things from now on, more consciously. But yeah, I mean, a lot of things that we learned today, and it was a pleasure listening to you and try to understand where are we falling short in the overall process. And I also would like to thank everyone who attended the webinar today for their time. I mean, we are still, although in the lockdown phase, but now weekends are more valuable after the lockdown has been lifted. But yeah, I mean, thanks everyone for putting an hour of your weekend to learn with us. Uh, and yeah, so for everyone, Komal is also speaking at our conference, which is alternately next weekend on Friday and Saturday. It's called Emerge 2020 HR Tech Summit. Uh, the link for the conference is under the chat section. If you are really interested, you can go there and grab 50% discount by using code webinar. I think that's it for the day. Thanks a lot again, Komal, for your time and all the content that you shared. And thanks everyone for attending it. Thank you. I'll end the session now. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.